This dude with his 38 flashy masks scammed over 3 million francs in crowd-funded charity cash across France after the war. He shredded that money, made a lion-shaped money mask, slapped it on his face, and danced like a crazy person, as if he was spitting in the world's face. These masks were his best armor. No one could find out his true identity or the purpose of his actions. Only those closest to him could barely see his sorrow and despair through the remaining half of his face behind the mask. This is a very long and complicated story. On November 9, 1918, the second last day of World War I, a military dog crossed the devastated battlefield and crept into a hidden trench. The bone-tired soldiers, some standing, some sitting, stared hard at the letter the dog brought. They were praying for news of the armistice. For long years of war had worn everyone out big time, and whether they were French or German, nobody wanted to pull the trigger on anyone else anymore. Lieutenant Pratt was the oddball. He was a war nut, hungry for power and money. He thought the more territory he grabbed and the more soldiers he threw into the meat grinder, the better his position would be at the post-war bargaining table. So, this guy, a real devil in uniform, flat out ignored the ceasefire order from above and gave the okay for a recon mission. He picked the oldest and youngest soldiers and forced them to crawl out of that trench and scout the front lines. Everyone knew how stupid it was to conduct reconnaissance in the enemy's area during the daytime, but orders were orders, and no one dared say no. A few minutes later, with 3 terrifying gunshots rang out, and young Talio got gunned down. Everyone went ballistic. Lieutenant Pratt had his excuse to start a bloodbath. In a flash, the battlefield was filled with smoke. The soldiers had no choice but to charge headfirst into the chaos, pushed on by the sound of the guns and the lieutenant's orders. In this godforsaken place where lives didn't mean much, shells could drop any second and blow these poor guys to smithereens. The only way to make it to the next day was to keep running and never stop. Albert was blown into the air. He rolled uncontrollably and actually rolled next to Talio. Even more crazy, Albert found that the bullet that killed Talio was shot from behind, which meant Talio was killed by their own man. Just then, Lieutenant Pratt, who was standing a few meters away, raised his pistol and fired at Albert frantically. Those who knew the truth had to die. While dodging those bullets, Albert took a tumble into a bomb crater. Lieutenant Pratt came after him, wearing a grin that spelled death. Out of the blue, a shell came screaming in. Everyone took off running. Just when Albert thought he'd cheated death, he got buried alive by the dust kicked up by that falling shell. Albert was sure he'd landed in hell, but when he opened his eyes, there was a horse's head right up against his face. He'd ended up in the same crater as a dead horse. A wild urge to survive welled up in him. He'd made it through 4 years of war without getting hit by enemy fire. With the armistice so close, there was no way he was gonna let himself get taken out by his own side's dirty tricks. That would be just plain dumb. So, he tore at the horse's thick lips with all his might, sucking in every last bit of that stinking, thin air, buying himself a few more precious seconds. And in doing so, he gave Edward a chance to come to his rescue. Edward and Albert were just fellow soldiers. The only thing they had in common was that they'd both given Captain Pratt a piece of their minds back in the trench. But that didn't stop Edward. With bullets flying all around, he dug his friend out of that makeshift grave with his bare hands. Albert spat out that foul-smelling air. Before he could even say thanks, a shell came hurtling straight for Edward. World War I ended, and Edward managed to pull through, but he lost half of his face in the process. After he woke up, he deliberately sent Albert, who was watching over him, away. Struggling to get out of bed, he flipped over a medical metal tray to use as a mirror. Then he pulled off the gauze on his face and saw a bloody, monster-like face. From then on, he couldn't speak and became a useless person who could only eat through a catheter. How could Edward, who had been a favored one and extremely talented since childhood, accept such a mutilated self? Albert saw what was going on and quickly gave him a shot of morphine, barely keeping Edward from falling apart. But every time he woke up, he'd just stare out the window, like he was thinking about ending it all. And whenever Albert closed the window, he'd lose his nerve and be stuck living in pain. This pain wasn't just in his head. Most of it came from the way his illness was tearing his body apart. The only thing that made him feel better was a lot of morphine. But the doctor was very stingy, and the dosage of medicine prescribed for him was not enough to resist the dense pain that came nonstop for 24 hours. The nurse was even worse. She just pointed at the cross on the wall and said, "Jesus suffered like this too." Albert had no choice but to sneak into the infirmary. He turned the cross on the wall upside down on purpose, stole the nurse's morphine, and injected it into Edward. Just like Edward had saved his life, he was gonna do whatever it took to ease Edward's pain. He'd saved his life, so now he felt responsible for him. For this reason, Albert wrote an application for transfer. He wanted to take him to a hospital in Paris where a chin prosthesis could be installed, so that when Edward went home, he wouldn't scare his father. All of a sudden, Edward got really angry, started yelling, and then scribbled on a piece of paper, "I don't want to see my father." Turned out, his dad had always been a touchy subject for Edward. When he was little, everyone told him his dad was super rich, but Edward thought his dad was a poor wretch who had never even given him a good night or a hug. And to make matters worse, his dad always shot him down, saying art was just a bunch of garbage. After his mom died, Edward lost all the love in his life. He grew up in his dad's coldness until he was 19. When the war broke out, he left home without looking back, getting away from his jerk of a dad who'd been holding him back, and joined the front lines. For him, dying on the battlefield was actually a kind of liberation. Watching Edward lose it, even motioning for him to kill him, Albert gave in. He decided to wipe Edward's existence from the records. So, Albert, who had always been timid and law-abiding, crossed the line again. Before the war patients were transferred, he mustered up the courage to sneak into the archive room. He found the record of a dead person who had grown up in an orphanage and exchanged Edward's identity with that person. After that, Edward vanished from the world and was reborn as a helpless orphan. Back in Paris, kind-hearted Albert didn't want Edward's family to get that cold, official death notice from the army. So, as Edward's buddy in the army, he sent them a letter and some of Edward's paintings. In the letter, he talked up how brave Edward had been on the battlefield. Looking at the paintings and the letter, Edward's sister broke down crying, but his dad didn't shed a single tear. He just stared at his wife's picture, lost in thought. At the same time, Albert started dealing with getting out of the army. He pushed his way to the front of the line, desperate to get that demob money and get him and Edward settled in Paris. The ironic thing was, not only did the staff give him a hard time, but after 4 years of risking his life for his country, all he got was 52 francs in demob money and 2 sets of used army uniforms sold to him at a cut-rate price. With prices skyrocketing, life was tough for these vets. But for Albert, the biggest headache was figuring out how to get more morphine. War left serious after-effects on these veteran soldiers. Most of them were disabled and needed morphine to relieve their pain in daily life. For those in a more severe situation like Edward, he developed a serious dependence on morphine during the treatment and couldn't get rid of it for the rest of his life. Albert used to be an accountant at the bank, but his job was long gone. No one waits around for a guy who's been MIA on the front lines for 4 years. To scrape by and keep Edward afloat, Albert took a gig as an elevator operator at an upscale hotel. All day, he'd just push buttons, shuttling rich guests up and down. But on his first day, there she was, his fiancée Cecile. Through the elevator's shiny metal, he saw her hanging off some other guy's arm, all smiles and batting eyelashes. Smelling the faint scent of high-end perfume on her, Albert finally understood why his fiancée hadn't replied to his letters. Such a luxurious life was beyond what he could give her. She spotted him too, but she acted like he was a stranger. When she left, she just slipped the engagement ring into his hand without a word. That was the end of them. Albert quit his job on the spot. But when he got home and saw Edward curled up on the sofa, seemingly waiting for death quietly, he soon regretted it. There was really no other way. Albert set his mind on the veterans in the city. He started snatching their morphine and hiding it in a secret place, and then giving Edward a dose when he was in pain. In this screwed-up world, good guys didn't stand a chance. Unlike them, Lieutenant Pratt was full of vigor. Just as he had originally planned, with his outstanding military achievements, he took a favorable position at the negotiation table and successfully obtained the contracting right of a military cemetery in Paris. which was responsible for providing burial services for the remains of the soldiers who had sacrificed for the country. However, burying the remains wasn't his purpose. Making money from it was his ultimate goal. He hired a group of illiterate cheap laborers and buried the remains randomly and chaotically. For example, a private belonging to the 6th Army was buried in the grave of a corporal from the 133rd Infantry Regiment. If anyone caught on, he'd threaten, intimidate, or bribe them into silence. He had plenty of dirty tricks up his sleeve. And just like that, he was living the high life while the other vets starved. One day, Louise, the landlady's daughter, bounded up the stairs with Edward's food and paper. But the guy she found was a whole new person. Edward was like he'd come back from the dead. He'd finally dragged himself off that ratty old couch and was standing on a rickety table, working away. Louise's arrival threw a wrench in his plans. Edward flew off the handle, dropping everything and barking at her to scram. But Louise didn't react. She stared straight at his face. Edward was infuriated. He took off his mask, trying to scare away this unfeeling girl. But instead of screaming, she reached out and gently touched his scars, her eyes full of pity. Edward was shocked by her kindness. He realized that not everyone in the world regarded him as a monster, as he had thought. In an instant, his empty, numb heart felt whole again. He'd finally found the guts to face the world. Then, something in the paper Louise brought caught his eye. To commemorate the great victory of the war and the soldiers who had sacrificed in the war, the city where Edward lived was going to spend a large sum of money to build a huge monument and carve the names of every hero on it. So there he was, half his face gone, holed up in a dumpy attic. But Edward decided it was time to expose the phony piece and shatter the lie. Albert dragged himself home, down in the dumps. Then he saw Edward, full of life, and it was like a punch in the gut, in a good way. He cracked his first real smile since the war. He was over the moon to see Edward back on his feet. Albert couldn't believe his eyes. Edward had made him an amazing gift, and he couldn't stop grinning like a kid on Christmas. But before he could be moved, he turned pale with fright at Edward's next plan.